Hello, and welcome to another discussion about issues of importance to Azerbaijan and the South Caucasus. I'm Dr. Joanne Lasowski, author and journalism educator. And joining us today is the former ambassador to Azerbaijan, Matthew Bryza. Ambassador Bryza was also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to Europe and Eurasia, and he is currently a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council. And welcome again, Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks, Joanne. It's always great to be with you. I learn a lot just from your questions, so thanks.
Well, you are very insightful and give me a lot more questions, I'll tell you that. If you don't mind, let's get started on kind of a recap of the year. The biggest event, of course, in the South Caucasus this year has been the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, being called now the Second Karabakh War. The tension had been brewing since before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and many nations had their hands in this conflict. Let's start with the outcome in Azerbaijan. Who gained and who lost in Azerbaijan?
Yeah, well, I mean, Azerbaijan won hugely. And this is the most catastrophic defeat in Armenian history, since at least, since the Bolsheviks took over, maybe since 1915. And Azerbaijan, so it was a military victory, the greatest probably in Azerbaijan's history. And I actually believe the November 9-10, depending upon where you were when it was signed, Moscow or Baku or Yerevan, agreement is really a positive one for Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan recovers all 7 of the territories Armenia had occupied. Azerbaijan gets a new corridor through the Armenian province of Megri, which opens up all kinds of new geoeconomic and geopolitical opportunities. But most importantly, Azerbaijan and everyone gets a peace settlement that's fair in my mind because it accords with the so-called Madrid Principles of November 2007 that the leaders of both Azerbaijan and Armenia accepted back in January of 2009. So about a year and a couple of months after we the Minsk Group co-chairs tabled those proposals or that proposal. And Azerbaijan also wins because it showed strategic restraint. Even though popular opinion wanted the Azerbaijani military to keep pressing the military offensive onto Hankendi, Stepanakert, and then by military force recover all of the remaining territories of Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan stopped at, in my mind, the smart moment. When Azerbaijan had recaptured Shusha, for Azerbaijan is the most emotionally and strategically important spot on that whole zone of conflict map. It saved, by doing so, thousands probably of lives, both Azerbaijani and Armenian, and both military and civilian, and thereby I hope laid the foundation for the international community to understand that Azerbaijan took the high ground. So Azerbaijan really won. But I would argue, of course, Turkey won as well, and therefore NATO won, even though this is not appreciated so much in Washington and maybe other NATO capitals. But from Moscow's perspective, the fact that there will be Turkish peacekeeping troops on the ground means that NATO peacekeeping troops will be on the ground. And so geostrategically, that should be highly valued by, of course, Turkey, who hasn't had a military presence in the South Caucasus in over 100 years. 1915 was the last time, but by all of NATO. Unfortunately, it's still not quite that point's not fully appreciated across NATO, but I hope it will be over time. Russia gained as well. I mean, Russia lost in terms of its perceived reliability among Armenians, but for better or for worse, Armenia really, it doesn't have an alternative to Russia as its quote unquote protector. Russia also, though, gained very much by getting its peacekeepers on the ground in Azerbaijan, something it's wanted for as long as I've been covering this part of the world. And it has a more muscular than usual peacekeeping force in place, which on the one hand would suggest that maybe it needs to have special capabilities because the situation is so tense. And we saw, what, last week or so, right? There were clashes again with apparently Armenian, I don't know if they're regular forces, renegades, or irregulars attacking Azerbaijani's forces near Hadrut. So yes, you need a muscular force. I think that Armenians, who hopefully will remain in Nagorno-Karabakh, insisted on having Russian peacekeepers because they trust the Russians. And I think for Azerbaijan to consolidate its victory, it's important that Armenians remain in Nagorno-Karabakh because then the victory is moral in addition to military and political. I think Iran lost because it really didn't play any role in mediating this conflict and doesn't have much to offer in rebuilding Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding territories. And now its critical role in supplying Nakhchivan will be less, dramatically less, if and when the new corridor across Armenia's district or province of Megri comes to fruition. And then, of course, Armenia lost, as I said, dramatically. And Pashinyan, I thought he wouldn't survive this politically, and he still may not. And, even the president of Armenia is calling for early elections, which everybody assumes will lead to his ouster. But he's still there. And sort of ironically, now President Putin really needs Prime Minister Pashinyan to deliver Armenia's commitments on the November 9/10 agreement.
So a little bit more back to Azerbaijan. Do you think that the outcome of this war has boosted the Aliyev government in the face of the people, in the people's opinion?
For now, for sure. I mean, President Aliyev is more popular than he's ever been right now, and even the opposition political leaders are praising this victory by Azerbaijan. So yeah, I think he's at the highest point of popularity he has ever been. I can't predict if it's a pinnacle or if it's part of an upward slope. But yeah, this look has
though he pulled back, pulled back in their minds. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean pulling back or stopping was not a popular decision. I know it was really controversial. But I as I said, I think that was an example of strategic restraint and wisdom. It was the right thing to do. And it seems to me that the initial disappointment in some quarters of Azerbaijan to that decision to show that restraint has faded a bit. And what I have said a few times is if you're especially an Azerbaijani male, although women can be great warriors as well, Azerbaijan's military is a little different from the US military, but if you're disappointed sitting in Baku in your office or your home that Azerbaijan didn't fight longer and all the way to quote unquote the end, then why were you sitting in your house in your office? Why didn't you volunteer? Why didn't you go risk your own life? And by the way, I know a nearly 70-year-old Baku fantastic man I've known for 20 some years who did just that. He volunteered. Yeah, I don't think he saw combat duty, but his last phone message to me, it was a voicemail, was, "Okay, Matthew, bye-bye. I may never see you again, but this is what I must do for my country." So if you really believe in continuing the war, you should have been there at the front.
Let's move a little bit now to Armenia. And Armenia has been significantly affected by the war, from protests against the prime minister to the bans of Turkish products, which I just heard about this week. What might be the longer term impact on Armenia?
Yeah, I hadn't heard about those bans on Turkish products. I think that's really short-sighted and unwise. Eventually, I hope that Armenia and Armenians will see that, again, this November 9/10 agreement provides a great strategic opportunity in the midst of a catastrophic loss. And that opportunity is, as the last point, the 9th point of that agreement states, that all transportation routes will be reopened. That means transportation between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and that means between Turkey and Armenia. And I was really at the center of the negotiations back in 2009 to normalize Turkey-Armenia relations. It was President Obama's huge priority. And what hasn't been reported very much, because very few people know this, is that Turkey went along with it always from the starting point that they would accept normalization with Armenia only if there was a significant breakthrough in resolving the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So in other words, Turkey was never going to stab Azerbaijan in the back, quote unquote, but it hoped that the possibility of normalization with Armenia would encourage Armenia to be more constructive at the negotiating table. And so obviously that breakthrough didn't happen, and the Turkish parliament never ratified the normalization agreement of 2009, October. But now that breakthrough has happened. And as I said, in the beginning, I believe that the solution or the resolution is fair because it's based on the basic principles that Armenia and Azerbaijan had previously agreed, with one important exception, which is there's nothing about any different status for Nagorno-Karabakh, legal status, than being part of Azerbaijan. In the basic principles agreed by both sides, there was the possibility that Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status would change. And President Putin, in a dramatic news conference or interview he gave several weeks ago, said on it was November, when was it? No, what was it? October 19 and 20. He had sat down with Pashinyan, or at least had a video call, and Aliyev as well, and said, dear Mr. Prime Minister, you should stop fighting now. I've convinced President Aliyev to stop. This was right, as Azerbaijan was about to take Shusha. And then you get the basic principles, which means there's the possibility of a change in Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status. And Pashinyan said, no, we're going to keep fighting. So he lost that. He fought too long, a war that Armenia could never win. So a big consequence for Armenia is, at least for now, Azerbaijan no longer accepts the possibility that Nagorno-Karabakh could ever be anything but part of Azerbaijan. Now, the French foreign minister on November 10th publicly stated, well, no, the Minsk Group needs to get re-engaged and negotiate that final legal status or change in legal status. But Azerbaijan, as the victors of the war, is refusing. So we'll see how that plays out. And I wonder how President Biden will react. Otherwise, though, inside of Armenia, it's a catastrophe. I mean, this is, the greatest loss, as I said, in Armenian history at least since the Bolsheviks took over, maybe since 1915. And so Pashinyan is fighting for his political life. President Armen Sarkisyan has called for new elections, as have many others. As we speak, there are protests in the street of Yerevan. I think those are driven largely, though, by the old regime. I don't know how popular they are. And I think basically Armenia is in a period of deeply painful collective soul searching. And like we know, however many stages of grief there are, okay, they finally gotten out of denial. Now they're clearly in anger. But there's nothing they can do to change the equation. Unfortunately, to quote President Trump, it is what it is. And so some Armenians are reacting in a deeply thoughtful way, like Jarad Liberadian, right, who was first Armenian independent president Ter Petrosyan's advisor on Nagorno-Karabakh. And he is saying, we way overestimated our importance to Moscow and Washington. We way overestimated our military strength. We lived false myths about our invincibility and our sort of divine justice path to the future. And we got to wake up. There are others, though, who are saying really scary things. Like I saw on a post on one Armenian American website where an Armenian American said they ought to harvest the nuclear waste from Metsamor nuclear power plant, build a dirty bomb and drop it on Baku. So that's vile, and I mean, just unfathomable. So I think Armenia is going to, inside Armenia, they've got a long period of soul searching to go through. And I guess now in this stage of anger, some people are coming up with really unwise ideas like, boycotting Turkish goods, instead of saying, okay, let's take advantage of the opportunities on the table, even though we suffered this loss. Sorry, that was a long one.
That's okay. It was really insightful, and I appreciate it. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to get back to, which is the Minsk Group. But one of my favorite topics is Mr. Putin, of course. And he gave a news conference, a year-end news conference recently, where he was asked by the state media, TASS agency, I think if it's not the state agency, it's very close to it, whether Russia will build up the peacekeepers in the region, and he said, yes, Russia may increase its presence if Azerbaijan agrees to it. So what do you think about Putin's interest in this region?
Yeah, I think first of all, the most immediate need he felt, I sincerely believe, was to stop the fighting and then get a peace agreement that is as close to those Madrid principles as possible. Because, you know, as much as I have been at odds, or as the U.S. has been at odds with Moscow with regard to Georgia, we have always been aligned with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh. And I'm not saying that Russia doesn't have its ulterior motives. I'm just saying that one of its goals was to get a fair peace agreement eventually. And I always thought that, the Madrid principles are a framework; they're not the final agreement. So I always assumed Russia was being so constructive because both Putin and Lavrov or Dmitry Medvedev, when he was president, they realized that, okay, they can agree the framework agreement, and still to finalize it, it'll take a lot of years of negotiation. So they can keep stirring the pot and have influence on the ground. Well, now this November 9/10 statement or agreement, that's the settlement. That's it. And so I think President Putin saw, to make that settlement hold, there had to be, as I said, a heavy or muscular Russian peacekeeping force. But B, the heavier or the stronger that peacekeeping force becomes, well, the more likely it is that Russia can transform the peacekeeping mission into a de facto protectorate, a de facto Russian protectorate, like South Ossetia or like Abkhazia. In the case of Georgia, because President Putin so hated Mikhail Saakashvili, just to put it bluntly, he didn't feel he needed any sort of agreement from the Georgian president. And in fact, the whole idea of that invasion in 2008 was to stop Georgia from realizing its ambition to join NATO. Azerbaijan's completely different, right? President Aliyev has articulated absolutely no ambition to join NATO. His foreign policy has been, and Haidar Aliyev's foreign policies have been based on, number one, of course, connecting Azerbaijan to the transatlantic community, but not too much, and always having good relations with Moscow as well. So I think for years, Putin has thought Moscow or Russia has all the influence he could ever imagine in Armenia. I mean, owns all the major economic assets. Its border guards command the southern border, now the western border of Armenia. Armenia's airspace is integrated into Russia's airspace. So if I'm behaving like a CEO of a company, I've got to grow. I've got to grow Russia's influence in the South Caucasus. I can't really grow much in Armenia. Where can I grow? I can grow in Azerbaijan. That's the big strategic prize. So therefore, Putin is both out of respect and out of pragmatism saying, yeah, we could increase the peacekeeping force if President Aliyev agrees. And I do believe Aliyev has a lot of negotiating leverage over this. But as time passes, I don't know how much of that will remain.
So I talked to Paul Goebel, and he made the comment that the fact that Russia was chosen to implement the peacekeepers was illegal. To have any outside nation who had any interest at all in the conflict or was any way involved in the conflict, to have them become the peacekeepers is not the way this is supposed to work. So what do you think about Russia being the peacekeepers?
Well, first, I think Paul Goebel is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. And we, throughout this, we've been, talking about that very topic and many others. And I'm not sure, I don't know what Paul actually said to you, but in my experience as a practitioner, it's not illegal. It's not illegal for a neighboring country to provide peacekeepers to a conflict, or a mediator country to provide peacekeepers to the conflict. It's not illegal, but it's against norms. So for the United Nations, their basic rule of peacekeeping is that, no neighbors to a conflict and no parties to a conflict should provide peacekeepers. So it was always a grave violation of UN principles that Russia provided peacekeepers in Georgia. When it comes to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we actually had a gentleman's or a gentleperson's agreement among the three Minsk Group co-chairs that no Minsk Group co-chair country would provide peacekeepers. That was our understanding. So Russia has gone against that understanding as well, but it's an understanding rather than a legal matter. It is legal for Russia to provide peacekeepers as long as the parties to the conflict agree, and they did. And why Armenia agreed to it is, well, we know why, right? I mean, Russia's been the traditional protector of Armenia. Why Azerbaijan did, I don't know why exactly, but to me, it's pretty clear that there was an urgent need for peacekeepers to separate the forces, urgent. And nobody else was stepping up to do that. France wasn't going to do it. The US wasn't going to do it in the middle of an election. The only option was Russia. Of course, the UN could have gone through its normal, or the OSCE could have gone through a peacekeeping building exercise, but the OSCE has never fielded a peacekeeping force, never in its history. Yes, the UN has, but that takes a long time. And at this point, there was an urgent need. And of course, Russia was ready, because for years, it had been looking for an opportunity to jump in and provide a peacekeeping force. And this became an issue while I was ambassador in Baku within the Minsk Group. And I had my strong views. And my successor as the Minsk Group co-chair had his views. But at the end of the day, I think that gentleman's or gentleperson's agreement held that Russia should not be able to allow peace to provide peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's maybe not illegal, but it is a geopolitical setback for Azerbaijan and for NATO. But going back to the beginning of our conversation, NATO and then Azerbaijan have a great possibility to counterbalance that Russian influence thanks to Turkey. Turkish peacekeepers, that is absolutely not something that President Putin wanted. And I think he was just simply compelled to agree to it. So there was some grand bargain that transpired, I think, among Presidents Aliyev, Erdogan, and Putin, and we get this balance of peacekeepers. Although the Russian peacekeeping force is, of course, much stronger than the Turkish one for now.
So you mentioned a couple of times the Minsk Group, OSCE Minsk Group, and you were highly involved in that. How did this heating up of the conflict tend to reflect on this group's effectiveness? And do they have a future?
I don't know that they have a future, and they were ineffective. Well, in mediating the tension since the summer, right? So in July, we all remember the military clashes, not in the Nagorno-Karabakh, but on the Armenia-Azerbaijan international border. And at that time, well, the Minsk Group really couldn't do anything because its mandate does not include the border. Its mandate is simply the zone of conflict in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. And so in addition to that, France under President Macron had already tilted way away from Turkic countries, so away from Azerbaijan and Turkey, and toward Armenia and toward Greece and Greek Cypriots. And then the U.S., under President Trump, has been strategically absent anyway from the South Caucasus. So after those clashes in July, it was clear that, as we discussed last time, Joanne, that Russia and Turkey were filling a diplomatic vacuum left by the U.S. and France, and Russia would be the one that would support and hopefully manage Armenia, which it did, and Turkey would be the one that would support Azerbaijan and provide it confidence and capabilities to do what it did. And yes, that is what happened. And also, though, to provide, I think, and I don't think this, I know for a fact, based on my own discussions in Ankara and Baku, that Turkey has worked hard to provide, political cover to the government of Azerbaijan to show that strategic restraint in stopping the offensive once it recaptured Shusha. So what I'm trying to say is, the Minsk Group, it had no role in mediating after the July clashes happened, no role during the second war in Nagorno-Karabakh. It was all Russia and Turkey, for better or for worse. And so, and then on top of it, with France having totally tilted toward Armenia during this and in the aftermath of this conflict, I just can't see why or how France could have any credibility as an impartial mediator. And we know that when the U.S. and French co-chairs were recently in Baku, President Aliyev very publicly said, "Why are you here? What do you want from me? I didn't ask for you to come here." That's tough, but it's completely understandable. What can the Minsk Group co-chairs do now? One thing is what they can do, which President Aliyev doesn't want to have happen. And that is exactly what the French foreign minister called for on November 10th, which is to reopen negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status possibly changing. If you're the president of Azerbaijan, why would you ever accept that? You just won this amazing military victory. Your Armenian counterpart had a chance to stop the war, weeks before and get the possibility of changing the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and he rejected that and lost. So it's like it would be irrational now for the leader of Azerbaijan, whoever it is, to come out and say, okay, Minsk Group, welcome. Let's negotiate a change in the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So that whole issue, though, is not resolved simply because Azerbaijan refuses to negotiate about it, of course, but time needs to pass. The dust needs to settle physically and psychologically, in Armenia in particular, before the Minsk Group, I think, can have any meaningful role in even proposing a restart of negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status.
Before I get to more discussion about US's part and some of the State Department comments, I want to talk more about Turkey, another country that was highly engaged in the conflict by supplying arms as well as moral support, as you've already said. US has implemented sanctions against Turkey now for the purchase of weapons that happened about a year ago, purchased from Russia. Is this a response to Turkey's part in the war?
Oh, God, no, not at all. No, not at all. And first of all, I'll say, yeah, Turkey provided, military technology and tactics that have changed the face of modern warfare. That sounds like a dramatic statement, and it is, and it's true. Turkey has developed these technologies over the course of the last 10 years or so, and the tactics just over the course of the last year, and employed them with incredible success in northwest Syria's Idlib province back late February and March, when Turkey fought Russian forces and Assad's forces to a standstill and forced Putin essentially to sue for at least a ceasefire, if not for peace. Same tactics and technologies were of great success in Libya in spring and May. Fought again Russian troops, supposedly under the banner of the Wagner mercenary company, but fought them and Haftar's Libyan National Army to a standstill and essentially saved the UN recognized government of Libya. And so the next phase in this was in the second Nagorno-Karabakh war. So Turkey has developed technologies and tactics that have made it, how to put it? Well, the Royal United Services Institute in London, the world's oldest think tank, said after the campaign in Syria that those tactics and technologies could make the main battle tank obsolete. The most important weapon on the battlefield since World War I, obsolete, unless the opposing army or military has the right electronic warfare capabilities, electronic camouflage capabilities, and close-in air defense capabilities. Armenia had none of those. So Turkey played a huge role, and of course, as you suggest, engendered hostility, definitely in Paris and in Washington, with Secretary of State Pompeo being quite critical of Turkey for doing that. But the sanctions on Turkey way predate this. I mean, the law, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, as you know, was passed in 2017. It was passed later. Sorry. The purchase was made in 2017 of the S-400s. CAATSA was passed afterward, but retroactively applied. And so President Trump has no waiver of the sanctions on Turkey under CAATSA, which CAATSA aims to punish Russia, not Turkey. It aims to punish Russia, right? And so if you are a country that participates in a major transaction, purchase of a weapon system, for example, from Russia, then you too are subject to those sanctions. And so President Trump was supposed to have applied those sanctions late last year. He refused. He ignored the law. In July of this past summer, he invited several U.S. Republican senators to the Oval Office for his meeting with President Erdogan to convince or to show President Erdogan that if Turkey, to put it simply, turned on the S-400 system or used it or took it out of the boxes, There was nothing President Trump could do to resist those sanctions, at least from a legal perspective. Nevertheless, Turkey took the systems out of the boxes in October, tested them in the Black Sea. Still, Trump did nothing. So finally, the Congress is fed up with the lame duck Congress, the lame duck president, fed up with Trump's refusal to implement the sanctions, so wrote those sanctions into the Defense Authorization Act, and by a veto-proof majority in both houses of Congress. So President Trump is now deciding, for other reasons in addition, does he veto the Defense Authorization Act? My guess is he won't, because Congress will override his veto. Even in the Republican Senate, they've got the 2/3 majority they need to override his veto, and Congress can't allow the veto to stand because everything is wrapped up in the Defense Authorization Bill, and not only all the funding of the U.S. military, but the State Department as well, and many other things. So Congress forced President Trump's hand, not because of what the support Turkey provided Azerbaijan just now, but because of the S-400 purchase as a unique situation, A, to punish Russia, but B, there is huge anti-Turkish sentiment in Washington, even well before the second war in Nagorno-Karabakh.
So there's not just anti-Turkish sentiment, but anti-Russian sentiment. Just recently, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Cooper was talking about the peacekeepers, I believe, when he said whenever Russia is involved, there is risk of disruption. So in addition to being sort of against Turkey, and I believe there's also a resolution or a bill pending in the House of Representatives somehow against Azerbaijan. But what do you think about Secretary of State Cooper and his, when Russia is involved, there is risk of disruption?
I totally agree with this Secretary Cooper. I mean, my experience in Moldova and Georgia is that, Russian peacekeepers, as one of my U.S. military general friends likes to say, they're not PEACE keepers, peacekeepers, they're PIECE keepers, right? They keep the pieces of the conflict and they keep the conflict going. So the Russian peacekeepers have been absolutely nefarious in the Transnistria conflict and in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I mean, I could go on and on of all the examples, but the one I'll share now is in August of 2008, as tensions were heating up between Georgia and Russia, but really between Georgia and South Ossetian separatists, the Russian peacekeepers positioned themselves between the Georgian government's military forces and South Ossetian separatist forces, so in between them, and then enabled or encouraged the South Ossetians to fire artillery at the Georgian troops, but over the heads of the Russian peacekeepers, because the Russian peacekeepers knew that Georgia would be put in an impossible dilemma, right? Either just absorb the artillery strikes and do nothing, and de facto the separatists would win, or shoot back and possibly kill Russian peacekeepers. And I can tell you, I mean, I was, for hours in phone calls with the Georgian foreign minister at the time, and initially she said, "Okay, we're holding our fire," which was the advice I was under instructions to give. She said that we knew you'd give that advice, but we're holding fire. We want to give the South Ossetians a chance to stop. And then several hours later, she finally called back and said, "Nope, the South Ossetians are escalating. They're using wider and wider caliber artillery, and we're going to respond. We're going to fight back." And so again, my instruction was to say we think that's unwise. And the foreign minister said, "We knew you'd say that, but we have no choice. We have to defend our territory." So that was the Russian peacekeepers provoking war.
So disruption follows for Russian peacekeepers.
But it's not an ironclad rule, and it doesn't have to happen in this case. And I think President Aliyev knows he has a chance to use all of his levers as well. To keep, including Turkish peacekeepers, to keep the Russian peacekeepers in check.
Now, you mentioned Turkish peacekeepers a couple of times, and you're further ahead on this information than I am, because there's not a lot of information about the agreement signed between Ankara and Moscow. Do you have more information that I can find? There definitely will be Turkish peacekeepers?
So I don't think there's been anything written down, or if there is, I've never heard of it. But yeah, well, right now on the ground are Turkish military forces that are conducting demining.
Okay.
And so that's not in the agreement. Yeah. All that's in the agreement is that there will be a peacekeeping center established. And I think that was put in the agreement because Turkey demanded some sort of a peacekeeping presence. And then Russia counterproposed, okay, how about this peacekeeping center? And Turkey said, okay. But I mean, based on my contacts here in Turkey and the Turkish government, it's clear to me that Turkey doesn't feel it needs Russia's permission to bring its peacekeepers in or its troops in to support its, fraternal country, ally. I mean, the cliche, as everybody knows, is one nation and two states. And so Turkey's support for Azerbaijan, by the way, in this conflict is unprecedented. In the past, Turkey had never offered any sort of active military support. Yes, it had sold weapons. Yes, it had provided military advice. But every time fighting had heated up, Turkey had called on both sides to stop fighting and return to negotiations. This time, Turkey's Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and President all said, whatever it takes, right? We'll make sure we give you all the support you need, Azerbaijan. So that's a huge shift. And in keeping with that, the 4 Turkish F-16s were on the ground throughout the war in the Ganja airport, and I think Turkey has just decided we're gonna send in whatever troops the traffic will bear. So the one additional piece of information, it's just sort of a rumor at this point, but my understanding has been that there will be some Turkish troops, peacekeeping troops in Agdam, but I haven't seen anything written down on that.
Well, thanks for the update. That's really important information. And you get it right there because you're, involved in Turkish. You're in Turkey. The world has tilted a little bit right now because there's a new U.S. president. Any advice to President-elect Biden regarding dealing with this area of the world?
Yeah.
You're the expert.
With great humility. That President Biden is amazing foreign policy thinker, and having had the huge honor to work directly with him a couple of times, I saw in action how systematically and strategically he thinks, and the same goes for Tony Blinken. They believe in, how to put it, working with our allies as the closest, the most important partners we could have, and that our alliances, especially NATO, are sacrosanct. So my advice would be follow your strategic soul and do what makes sense for the United States and our friends and allies. And I have no doubt that eventually, as the domestic political dust also settles in Washington after this election, that both Biden and Blinken are going to understand that the Trump and Obama administrations made colossal mistakes by following essentially, at least in President Trump's mind, a Russia first policy. And the Russia reset was that. And that the U.S. had made tremendous gains strategically for the entire transatlantic community over a couple of decades in the South Caucasus, and more or less at the highest level abandoned that during the past, whatever it is, several years. So I guess my advice would be have a strategic plan. Fall back on your instincts. Don't have a Russia first policy, which Biden won't. But redefine and reacquaint yourself with all of the policy issues that we were working on together, especially with Tony Blinken when he was on the NSC staff, to bring not only stability to the South Caucasus, but strategic gains for the transatlantic community, meaning the oil and gas pipelines, and now fiber optic lines and the road, highway, and railroad. Have a strategic plan that is keeping in mind the opportunities we face if we can not only stabilize this conflict, but build on it. And going back again to the beginning of our conversation, get all those transportation lines reopened between Armenia and its eastern and western neighbors. Support big infrastructure investments through the new corridor in the south. Maybe a new gas pipeline. There'll be a new railroad. Maybe fiber optic links. Seize an opportunity to put U.S. strategic interests at the top of the pyramid.
That brings me to a question I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask, but
Please do. Sounds good.
any advice? Is there, with your huge experience in this area, is there any possibility of a future Ambassador Bryza?
Yeah. Nobody's asked me about that. I mean, from the transition team, I have no plan. Golly, if someone did, it would be torture for me, because I love this life of mine, and I'm building, one company that provides environmental solutions to oil spills and chemical spills and treatment of hazardous waste, and another company, a strategic consulting company involved with some amazing projects and huge satellite networks and fiber optic networks as well. So I just, my whole family loves living here in Istanbul so much. So, you know what, I hope there's no such opportunity, because as a patriotic former diplomat and civil servant, I mean, you have to do your patriotic duty, but I do not want to leave where I am right now at all. Thank you for asking.
You bet. And just to close, do you have any more broad, long-term, year-end hopes for the people of the region?
Yeah, of course. I mean, at the risk of sounding like I'm simply summing everything up, I hope that goodwill, strategic restraint, humanitarian gestures, by the way, as Azerbaijan has been showing by giving the Armenians leaving Kalbajar an extra 10 days, by facilitating humanitarian assistance into these same areas. I hope that will gain traction, and that the anger that's out there in Armenia about Azerbaijan, right now, that's a reflection of strategic shame, but also in Azerbaijan, among those people that thought Azerbaijan didn't go far enough and, inflict sufficient death on the other side. I hope that those horrible attitudes will fade, and instead both sides will see these great opportunities that are now out there. And then I wish that all of us, I mean, our U.S. leaders and all of our transatlantic leaders will see things in the same way, and will somehow shake themselves from their stupor of assuming that somehow Turkey has encouraged Azerbaijan to launch a war and pushed it to be more aggressive, and missed the whole point about strategic restraint, about how many lives were saved as Azerbaijan essentially brought the whole conflict back in line with international law, recovered its territories, and chose to save lives and treasure, save blood and treasure, rather than continuing the fight. So I hope and I pray that will be appreciated, and then finally, that the international community, whether it's the development banks, the European Investment Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Finance Corporation, all of our transatlantic communities, trade and investment agencies, will provide the support needed to rebuild. Because the Azerbaijani government now estimates it's going to need at least $100 billion to rebuild. Doesn't have that money. I think it'll probably be more than that. If the international community comes together and recognizes Azerbaijan's restraint and helps the Armenian side heal, which has to happen. Armenia needs to heal, for God's sake, please heal. That's the way Azerbaijan can consolidate a victory for everybody, which is what? Which is Azerbaijanis and Armenians live together again in Nagorno-Karabakh as neighbors who actually like each other, as they did in the past, before sneaky people, as they say in Russian, zhuliks, in 1988 started to stoke nationalist tension, just as Slobodan Milosevic did in Serbia and in Kosovo and in Bosnia, with tragic consequences. Instead, let the international community provide that financial support that facilitates the return of Azerbaijanis to their old homes, to live next to Armenians who feel safe enough to stay. That is a gigantic victory for everybody.
Well, your hopes are the same as mine, and I appreciate your insights, Ambassador Matthew Bryza, and I'm sure we'll be checking with you again in the new year to hopefully have better news and positive things happening in the region. And thank you
thanks.
for your time. Thank you.
I thank you, Joanne. Such an honor to be with you, and it was fun. Thank you.
Happy holidays too.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks.